So what is known about Johann? When do the first records appear?
Okay, I want to explain on the map kind of how things traveled, how Johann would have traveled, and how the family would have traveled, kind of in general. We started off here in Philadelphia. This is where the ship would have come in from Deal, England. When he got here, like I said, there was a wagon train, or I don't know exactly how they got there, but they might have walked. It's not awful far to this area right here, and they're called the Pennsylvania Dutch, or Deutsch, really, they should be called. It's also interesting, right here in Delaware, the state of Delaware, there's a curved area right here. If you look on a map, it's just what happened is one of the governors were awarded a piece of property, and they were free to give away this property if they wanted to. So he simply took a protractor, went on there, and drew an arc. And that's where Delaware's got this curved part on the top. Now the story about that is Benjamin Franklin signed a piece of property rights to one of the Hokes. Now, I'm not sure. I don't think it was our direct ancestor. It's a brother of an ancestor. So he was right on this curved area, and so he had paid his taxes to the township that he was in, which would have been in Pennsylvania. And then a few months later, after they drew this curved area, the new owners of that property wanted him to pay some taxes too. This is the story I read somewhere in a letter. I wish I would have kept a copy of that, but he said what happened is the guy said, no, I'm not going to pay taxes. I already paid taxes. No, you didn't. So they had a big fight. He trashed the tax collector and sent him on his way. Well, the next day, the tax collector came back with a couple other men and beat up this Hoke guy, the owner of the property, and took one of his cows as tax payment. That ticked him off so bad that what he did, he just left this area and migrated down toward Raleigh. I don't know what attracted him there or whatever, but he hated that area and he wouldn't stay there anymore. Down here, he set up shop, had set up homestead and everything, and the descendants of this guy ended up being Robert E. Lee's right-hand man during the Civil War, which would have been in 1860, 1865. And if you go to Raleigh, North Carolina, and there's a North Carolina museum there, you can go in there and you can actually see a display showing Robert Hoke's, I think it's like a tent, sword, a Bible, an evening jacket, and some other stuff. And you can see that this guy was like the #2 man in the Confederacy during the Civil War. I thought, it's interesting that he was like the #2 man, but he was on the wrong side. Oh well, that's the way it goes. So this is the only Robert Hoke that had made it, in a high rank. We have some other Robert Hokes in our family that had nothing to do with this guy. This guy left the area and went down south. Subsequently, the family, others also went down this way, and they ended up coming over. I don't know why. I think it's because the property and the land and people know people and whatever. They kind of ended up going this way even. And then when they settled in this area, there are Hokes in Mississippi. I remember tracing some of them down. This is when Texas was a country. There was, for a little while there, Texas was an independent country, and they were offering free land. And so a number of Hokes actually went down to Texas area. Some of them in the Austin and San Antonio area. And so there's a number of Hokes that are down there. They're very distant relatives of ours, but it's just interesting how they got there. Okay, the big thing is this Pennsylvania Dutch. That's where all the progenitors, the ancestors of ours, actually came from. Other Hokes up the Mohawk Valley, if they couldn't afford to pay their cruise or their cost across the ship, couldn't afford to pay the cost of the passage to Philadelphia, they ended up in these areas here. And a lot of them died, a lot of them didn't make it, but a lot of them did, and so they kind of took to New York area. Some of them, a couple went up to Canada actually. There's a record of one Hoke, I'm not sure, I think he was from the Pennsylvania Dutch. He actually went to to the Toronto area, and he was a pastor, and he set up some sort of a revival going on up there that kind of helped, bring a lot of people to Christianity. I don't know much about that. I just saw a comment. Just kind of a little bit of a diversion, but the colonists were just this area here. These areas weren't defined yet. There were no state lines. It was just like Pennsylvania went way out to here, and Virginia went way out to here. These other states weren't defined. So the colonist leaders wanted people to go west, because if you have people going there, then you can claim the land. And so they developed what's called the National Highway. I don't know exactly where it started, but it was somewhere, probably started in Philadelphia, and it moved. All it is a trail. They cut down the trees and they improved it enough so wagons and horses could go by. They could have way stations where they could get water or food or rest overnight. But that was enough to get them moving west. So the National Highway went something like this. And by the time it got to Indiana, it kind of started, I don't know what you want to call it. They just didn't do as much work on it. There was a lot of people here. This was a flatter land. They could find other ways to go west. So from this point in Indiana, it started breaking off, and people would go different ways to get out west. But now our ancestors did something slightly different, along with a lot of other Germans and the Pennsylvania Dutch. When it got crowded here, like Johann Jacob's 15 children, there was others who had family just as big. Pretty soon they started having issues like, well, they can't afford to buy the land. Nobody wants to sell it. The land isn't free anymore. There were family problems, like it was typical for a German boy to marry a German woman. And if they didn't do that, then they were kind of looked like, why are you marrying this foreigner? And I know in our case, that was the case. And so when that happened, they were kind of ostracized, and so they would be pressured to move away. So there's a lot of reasons why people left this here area. Okay, before I really define how we went west, there was the Revolutionary War here in 1776. I'm sure you know about that from school. It lasted until 1782. At least 7 Hokes related to us were listed as having been part of the Revolutionary War. Apparently, there's no indication that any of them were killed in it. I mean, it's likely that some were, but I could not find any record of it, because what you look at is you look at the mustering out pay. After they're done fighting, they get a pay for leaving, and they got like $2-3 or something. It's pretty nothing, but anyway, they were all listed. You can find this online now if you want to search it, but you got to be willing to look for the right name. It's not a H-O-K-E. It would be H-O-O-K-H-A-C-K, all kinds of stuff. But you can trace them. Interesting enough, 2 Hokes were present at the British surrender at Trenton, New Jersey, which would be right here. That's when Cornwallis finally gave up. The war was over. The British left. And so this would have been a great deal for them, because when the British left, they were required to lay down their weapons. They were required to lay down their swords, their guns, and there would have been hundreds, thousands of them. And so when they left, one of the rewards was, well, take a gun. If you were an officer, you got to take 2 guns and a sword, or some sort of divvy like that. So anyway, here's these guys who were fought in the war. They walk off with a couple of rifles and a pocket full of, bullets, I don't know, or some other goodies. So these guys would have been pretty happy to go back home with all kinds of goodies like that. There are other men that were pretty famous that went down this area. One of them that ended up in Georgia was a governor for a couple of years, and a pretty famous lawyer. I'm not exactly sure what he did, but he was mentioned quite a few times. There was a number of authors and other local statesmen. So once they got down this area, they started doing well. But they are distant relatives. So Johann stayed in this area, and he died in 1766 on June 21st. He was about 71 years old. And like I mentioned in the book, he had a long list of inheritance that he gave to different kids, and it kind of gives you an idea who he wasn't happy with, who he was happy with. Gave somebody got an overcoat, somebody else got a bunch of money. So you got to wonder, okay, what's with the overcoat guy? He must have been mad at him, but I don't know. If you care to go out to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which would be, well, it's down this corner. You can actually find the homestead. It's obviously not the real one, but it's one that was kind of rebuilt or fixed up to look like it might have looked then. There's also something called the Hoke Meeting House, and apparently there were enough Hokes there that they had what sometimes went for a city hall, county hall, or whatever, and that's where the Hokes would get together and they would decide whatever things they had to decide. So this was back when the Germans still kept a tight community. They probably spoke primarily German, and a number of their kids and stuff were starting to learn to speak English, and that's when the German language kind of started dying out by the time that Johann died. So what I'd like to just also point out is once they left this area, whoever left the area probably went down. There's the Ohio River. The Ohio River is like right here. And there are other rivers feed into it. What they would have done is somehow they would have gotten over to this river, and they would have taken a barge, because no sails wouldn't work on a river, there was no steam yet, so they were unpowered rows or rowboats maybe, and they would have gone gradually down this river all the way down to Louisville. Now Louisville at the time was kind of the frontier, and that's where they were giving away land. So I'll talk more about this later, but I just want to show how this kind of works on the map. So right in this area here is where some of our ancestors settled, because that land was being given away for free. They didn't realize how different this was from this area here. As a result, this was very, very harsh. The people who got down there, they were not able to send their kids to school. They were illiterate. 2 generations were illiterate. So the first settler went here, and the next one went over here, not too far away. But by that time the land was getting pretty much given away, and what was left was the Indian lands of Indiana, which is the southwest corner, present-day Sullivan County. And so I even have a record that shows a land certificate for Samuel Hoke, and it's signed by President Martin Van Buren for a piece of property in western Indiana. So what this guy did is one of the brothers of one of our ancestors, he would have moved over here someplace. Now I didn't do any further work down in Sullivan County, but there's a lot of Hokes down there. There's a Hoke graveyard, there's a lot of records, there's several books written about those Hokes. The problem with this area is that it was great farmland. All those people did really well. There's reports about how these guys were wealthy enough that they took trips down to Mexico to do hunting. It's like, wow. But as time went by and locomotives started making their presence, these rivers did not have bridges because they were such big rivers. So this area got kind of isolated, and as a result kind of decreased in its economic capabilities. And even today it's Sullivan County is kind of decreasing. Excuse me, there's Evansville down there, but most of the back county is kind of dying out and people left. All right, so what would happen to our ancestors? There's two areas over here that were rivers in those days. Later on in the 19th century, they were dammed up and they became land between the lakes. So these were lakes in here. On this side was the Indian lands, the Chickasaw Indians, and they had moved over there from here because of treaties and conflicts with the settlers. And this area between the lakes was kind of a no man's land. The Indians really didn't go over there and claim it, and the white settlers didn't go over there and claim it. And areas to this side of it were being opened to settlements. One of our direct ancestors, and I'll talk about this some more later, apparently got in a difficulty with his family and decided to wander out this area and see what was out there. when he was only like 17 or 18. Apparently he ended up in the land between the lakes, and he found a woman, an Indian woman who was wandering out there named Magaha. And the reason I know anything about this is there's a guy I rented, okay, and then Robert would have gone back to the area where his parents lived in roughly 1850, 1855, and been rejected because of his taking up with the Indian woman Magaha. He would have been probably then attracted by the free land that was being offered in Indiana. So he went across the river and went to Greene County. Now, one common thing that went on there is that if a man took up with an Indian woman, that was kind of uncomfortable, so what they would do is give her a Christian name and then marry her. And so he gave Magaha the name Catherine Magahe, and his mother's name was Elizabeth Catherine, so for some reason he followed that naming. But so anyway, named her Magahe, named her Catherine Magafi. I can't remember because there's 3 different spellings of it. So it sounded like she was Irish, but she wasn't. She was the Indian woman. And then married her and made her a Hoke. And there's records of that in Greene County. He didn't stay there very long, maybe a year or two. And then it was attracted to the possibility of jobs in the Coal Bluff area, where it's not far from Fontanet, of course. And so for some reason, he was attracted there, and he went to that area, and that's where he stayed until he died. Just a couple other side notes. We know that some of the Hokes here migrated out west. They went to Missouri. Some of them, there's one at least that went to Minnesota, went up north. And another odd one is a fellow apparently during 1849, which is the 49ers. You ever heard of the gold rush and the 49ers? He decided to go out to California and seek his riches out there. I don't know how he got out there, whether he went down the Mississippi, got on a ship, went down around the Horn, and ended up in San Francisco, but he got out there somehow. And it didn't take him more than a couple of years to decide this is not working. So he got onto a ship, which they were paying quite well because they couldn't find any sailors. Once somebody sailed into the harbor, they jumped ship and they wanted to go find themselves some gold. So it didn't work for him, and he got on a ship, and apparently it went to Hawaii. And when I was out in Hawaii for a while, I just sort of looked around and I found a Hoke out there. Now, that was the funniest thing, because in Hawaii, the names are very long and they're very sing-song. And I'm going to, murder this this pronunciation, but it could have been something like Wana Wana Mahi Nahu Nana Hoke, and then it was Huda Huda Wana Wana Mama Hoke. And I went, what? The names are about that long, then Hoke, So I checked into it a little bit and found out that's what happened. This guy, that their tradition says that he came across from central U.S. and went to the gold fields and went out there. So there's a whole string of Hawaiian Hokes that they look nothing like us. I know the lady that I saw that was Wana Wana Mama Nanini Hoke. She was very, very large and very short. But like I said, I have no idea what relation to us. They're just interesting. Side note. Other than that, that's about all the travels I know. Hokes were dispersed to other places, but if you look at a map that shows where the Hoke name appears, you'll see that most of them are here, New York, and then they're splattered other places. There was even a Hoke in Alaska that I found once, but I didn't pursue him. Well, I showed you on the map general how the movements of the family was, but I would like to elaborate on some of them too. One thing people who are into genealogy like to look up is the coat of arms, or the family shield. It's not exactly clear that Johanns came over here with a family crest, but we know that there were at least 3 that were found, and the one that was in Johann's family appears to look like this. The meanings of it are shown here. There's a home, family, the road of life here, the skilled crafts, skilled tradesman, is like this symbol. the Cross of Christ, because they were all German Lutheran Christians, and the rock, which was the confession of faith to Christ. So the idea was to show this is the path of life, in and up, when you die and go to heaven, and it's dominated by the cross. So this was kind of their viewpoint, because they, as I said in a previous video, they were very much into the Lutheran Church.
You said to keep Johann Samuel in mind. Tell us about him.
Johann Samuel, yeah, he was the child of predecessor, our ancestor, and he was the second child of Johann. He was actually born in Germany, but he came across at the age of about 10, made that trip and survived it, which is pretty amazing in itself. He was born in Altrip, which is now Altrip, Germany. You can look that on a map if you like. And it's on the Rhine. And in the German naming tradition, he was named Johann Samuel. Sometimes is referred to in records as Samuel, and sometimes as Johann. So it's kind of confusing, but you can eventually figure out who's who by who the wife was, who the children were, when he was born, when he died, where he was, things like that. This caused a lot of problems for me initially, because I didn't understand how screwy that was. Plus, the last name changed sometimes too. They would say spelling wasn't considered important in those days. It wasn't until, I can't remember when they started making a standard dictionary, but it was in the early 1800s, I think. It's kind of funny, one of the presidents was complaining about the requirement that English words be spelled a certain way, and his quote was, it's a damn poor mind indeed that can think about one way to spell a word. So there nobody liked having that, one word, one spelling, one way. But prior to this, you never know. They were going to spell things differently. You had to be pretty flexible, and initially when I did this research, I wasn't. I expected to see things a certain way, and it wasn't until later that I started being flexible enough to really try to understand this background. So Johann Samuel had 9 children. The third one was our ancestor, and his name was given as Andreas, Johann Andreas, and apparently he was commonly called Andrew. Well, Johann Andreas was like baptismal records and some other records, but the records went down quite often as Andrew. He was born in 1757, so that was before the Revolutionary War. 2 or 3 of Johann Samuel's boys must have served in the war, because there's records about that in the Revolutionary War as a listed of veterans of the Revolutionary War, which is actually online. They have it online now. One of his boys, Johanns, kind of odd, but he was the one that moved to North Carolina, the one that got his cow stolen and gotten beat up because he didn't want to pay taxes twice. He's the one who went down to North Carolina and ended up being the great-grandfather of Robert E. Lee's second right-hand man. So I didn't follow him. And at least one of the others moved to the southern states. They got to keep in mind at this time, it was getting crowded there. And the lure of free land was just too much to ignore. Unfortunately, they didn't realize how difficult those free lands were. They weren't open lands and nice lands of Pennsylvania. They were rugged terrain of Kentucky and southern Indiana and Tennessee. So in about 1795, this particular Andrew, decided to move. Now, there's another grandfather, another man, Johann Andrew, who moved to this Louisville area. I don't want to confuse him with him. It's easy to confuse the two, but I guess I won't get into it too far other than to say that this guy married a woman named Maria McKee, and that would have been Irish, or I'm not exactly sure, but certainly it wasn't German. And if that's the case, then he probably felt some pressure to leave the area of southern Pennsylvania. So once they were in the Louisville area, in roughly 1800, there was another census, and this is when I said that they tried to change all the names to English spelling, so our name was anglicized, so whatever it was before, H-umlaut, O-C-H, or H-O-C-K, or H-O-O-K, or whatever it would have been translated to Hoke, H-O-K-E at that time, because all the records after that pretty much all show Hoke, H-O-K-E, so from roughly a little after 1800 on, when you look up stuff, you'll find H-O-K-E as a spelling. So anyway, they were attracted down this area because of the free land. So they got down there and they set up their farmstead and tried to have a normal life. But because of the remoteness of it and the difficulty, like I said, there were few schools, and unfortunately, any children born down there or raised were probably illiterate, unless they just happened to be fortunate enough to learn enough from their parents or from other people. Census, when they take a census, they ask, are you illiterate or not? And you can see on the census it said illiterate for about 2 generations there. So this Andrew and Maria had at least 5 children. One child was named William Samuel. This guy was confused with a lot of other people because quite often they dropped the William. So I don't know how he addressed himself, but I finally figured out on various records that his name was either going as William or Samuel. I had to figure out when he was born or died. And so anyway, William Samuel, in this area of 1800 to 1850, it was difficult living, like I said. And there were some threat of Indians there. They would have had these fairly crude log cabins. I'll show a picture of it at this point. They were small, very small. The guys typically didn't like living in it. They would probably sit up outdoors. The woman would probably sit up inside. The baby and the children would be inside. And it's very, very small. It's hard to imagine trying to live in these tiny little things that were maybe 1 or 2 windows at most. They were largely drafty, unheated. They caught fire pretty easily. It's like, oh. So it was difficult times. Something of interest that happened during Andrew's time and William Samuel as a boy is in that area. He lived on what's called Floyd's Fork, which is south and west of Louisville. That's close to another place called Cain's Ridge, or Cain's Ridge Run. In about 1801 or 1802, I can't remember which, there was a very famous Christian revival. Now, you got to remember, this was a very remote frontier, and about 20,000 people came to this, which was an astounding number, because that would have meant everybody within a day's ride would have come there, because what was happening, something spectacular was happening. Apparently there was what they call a Holy Ghost revival, and people were really feeling the presence of God, and there was people who were going crazy and doing other crazy stuff, but it got noted as something that was a very prominent event, and it actually changed the nature of the whole area, because like I said, people coming out in that area were illiterate. They didn't know how to read the Bible. They were kind of drifted toward being wild, lawless. And by having this thing happen, they began to focus on obeying the 10 Commandments and looking to God and not just doing whatever they wanted to do. And so they began to more set up laws and set up schools and things like that. So that event was pretty pivotal in the development of that area. And it's kind of notable because I am certain that Andrew and William Samuel would have known about it and probably would have went to it. Maybe they didn't stay but a little while, but it would have been amazing if something like that happened and they didn't go, because it would have been like, a few hours ride on a wagon or something. Anyway, Andrew died a few years later in 1804, and William Samuel ended up living on his father's land in about the same area.